We've been exploring the intricate dance of justice, order, and social cooperation. Now, let's pivot to a figure often seen through the lens of economics, Friedrich Hayek. His book, The Sensory Order, published way back in 1952, has been gathering dust on the shelves for decades, mostly ignored by philosophers. But recently, folks in economics and political science are digging it up, wondering if it secretly underpins his famous ideas about markets and society. Others spot echoes of connectionism in cognitive science. Yet the real philosophical goldmine, that's where we're headed. Despite not being a philosopher by trade, and despite his famous cousin Ludwig Wittgenstein and his pal Karl Popper, Hayek didn't really tap into the main currents of analytic philosophy in his time. But don't let that fool you. His take on the mind, buried in this work, is surprisingly profound. Now, why should we care about this old book? Well, forget the hype about it being the secret sauce for Hayek's economics or politics. Sure, both the mind and the market are complex, dynamic, unpredictable systems, so what? Is meteorology the foundation of everything then? No, that's just superficial. The real treasure in the sensory order is Hayek's attempt to build a philosophy of mind. It's not polished like modern academic writing, maybe lacks some buzzwords, but it tackles the big questions head on. Think Russell, Wittgenstein, Searle, Dennett. Hayek somehow manages to weave together threads from across the philosophical spectrum. Some might say it's a failed attempt at naturalizing the mind, echoing his friend Popper's view. But even if it stumbles, the way it stumbles is fascinating, offering unique lessons about the limits of our understanding. So how are we going to unpack this? First, we'll lay out Hayek's theory, trying to tease out its philosophical core. We'll see how his ideas connect to major thinkers, both his contemporaries and those who came later. And crucially, we'll look at how his unique blend of ideas might actually help fend off some standard objections that would sink other theories individually. Then we'll turn to the critique that really stung, Karl Popper's objections. We'll examine what Popper saw as the fatal flaw and argue that even though Hayek's view ultimately faced the same challenges as other naturalistic approaches, he tackled them with a certain heroic persistence, even if the battle was lost. Alright, before we dive into Hayek's specific take, let's quickly recap the philosophical battleground. When philosophers talk about the mind, they usually focus on two tricky things. First, qualia, that's the subjective feel of experience. Think about the pain when you stub your toe or the smell of fresh coffee. It's directly accessible only to you, right? That's the private subjective side. Second, intentionality, this is the aboutness of thought. Words like cat mean something beyond themselves, and our thoughts about cats are directed at actual cats. Language gets its meaning from us, users with minds. Both of these are problematic for naturalism. How can purely physical processes in the brain account for the unique subjective feel of qualia? And how can meaningless electrochemical signals in the brain magically acquire the rich meaning of intentionality, like language does? Explaining how these mental aspects relate to the physical brain and body, that's the classic mind-body puzzle Hayek tries to tackle. Hayek, in the sensory order, frames his problem specifically around sensory qualities, our qualia. He asks, how do these different physiological impulses in the nervous system become differentiated in their functional significance, so their effects mimic the differences between seeing red versus blue, or hearing a tone versus silence? His goal, he says, is to show that the system of relations between physical events mirrors the system of relations between mental events. Now hold on, this framing isn't neutral. It assumes upfront that there's an identity between these two systems of relations. It focuses on structure, on how things relate, rather than intrinsic properties. This immediately flags Hayek as engaging with deep philosophical waters, potentially aligning with structuralist ideas we'll see next. Where did Hayek get these ideas? A big influence was Ernst Mach. Mach had this radical idea. We only know the world through our sensory experiences, the qualia. Physical objects? Just bundles of sensations. Hayek agreed with Mach on the epistemological point. Our knowledge starts with these sensory qualities, a kind of empiricism. But here's where Hayek diverges sharply from Mach's anti-realism. Hayek believed there was indeed a real external physical world out there. How could he square this? By borrowing heavily from Moritz Schlick and Bertrand Russell. They argued that science doesn't tell us about the intrinsic nature of physical objects, but only about their causal structure. Think about it. We see a tree, but physics tells us about its mass, composition, gravitational pull, not about what it looks like or feels like intrinsically. Our sensory qualities, then, are features of our experience, not the external objects themselves. Hayek bought into this indirect realism. Another key influence was Rudolf Carnap, with his book The Logical Structure of the World. People often think Carnap just reduced the physical world to sensations like Mach. But Carnap also spent a lot of time analyzing the sensations themselves. He wanted to define sensory qualities systematically, based on their relationships to each other, creating a logical structure, an Aufbau. Hayek picked up this baton. He argued that the entire order of sensory qualities can be understood just by looking at all the relationships between them. Why? Because, as Hayek put it, you can only communicate differences between qualities. If a quality had some absolute non-relational feature, we couldn't describe it or communicate about it. This focus on structure as the key to intelligibility and scientific description strongly resonates with Carnap's project. Now, here's where Hayek gets really creative. Thinkers like Schlick and Russell use structuralism to understand our knowledge of the external physical world. We know its causal structure, not its intrinsic nature. But usually, they stopped short when it came to internal mental states like qualia. They thought introspection gave us direct access to intrinsic, non-relational qualities. Hayek flipped this. He said, "Hold on, why not apply structuralism to the internal world too?" So, just as we know the physical world only through its causal structure, Hayek proposed we know our mental world only through its structural relations. For him, all knowledge, whether of the external world or our internal experiences, is knowledge of structure. The difference isn't that only the physical world is relational, it's that the relations differ. If the mind is just a structure, and the brain is a physical thing that can also exhibit a structure, then maybe, just maybe, the mind-body problem becomes solvable. Hayek takes this structural idea one step further. He argues that the mental structure isn't just any abstract structure, it's a causal structure. The difference between seeing red and blue isn't some mystical essence, but the difference in the effects these experiences have, how they trigger other perceptions, memories, or actions. This sounds remarkably like functionalism, the idea that mental states are defined by their causal roles. Think about it. If the mind's essence lies in its functional organization, then in principle, a mind could exist in silicon chips, alien brains, or anywhere else, as long as the causal connections were right. Hayek explicitly said this, decades before functionalism became mainstream. However, his version wasn't the computer program kind. It was inspired by neuroscience, modeling the mind after the brain's operations, and identifying the mind with the brain's functioning in creatures like us. So, how does this work neurologically? Hayek imagines the brain forming connections. External stimuli hit the senses, triggering neural impulses. Repeatedly, certain groups of neurons fire together, associating with specific features of the world. An orange consistently triggers a particular pattern of impulses, different from those triggered by a car, even though both are orange. The distinctive quality of that orange experience, the feeling of arrangedness, doesn't come from some magic property of the impulses themselves. Instead, it comes from their position within the vast web of all the connections in the brain. Hayek uses the term superimposition. The brain superimposes various sets of neural activity, and this specific combination creates the conscious experience of an orange, along with the urge to eat it, distinguishing it from, say, the experience of an orange car. It's the whole interconnected pattern that matters. This combination of structuralism for both the external and internal worlds is quite striking. Hayek seems to be suggesting that the same reasoning that leads us to structuralism for the physical world, like Russell's point about perception being mediated by causal chains ending in the brain, should apply to introspection too. If we only perceive the end of a causal chain, a brain event, not the start, the external object. Maybe we only introspect the end of another causal chain, the structure of our mental states, not their intrinsic nature. So, introspection itself is a kind of classification, a higher order process monitoring lower order mental states. This sounds uncannily like higher order theories of consciousness, where consciousness arises when a mental state is represented or monitored by another mental state. It's a specific flavor of functionalism focusing on this monitoring relationship. Okay, so functionalism often faces the objection, but the subjective feel, you can't reduce that to causal relations. Hayek's unique position might actually help counter this. Standard functionalism often takes for granted that the brain is like we experience it, a gray, squishy lump. Of course, an experience feels different. But Hayek, following Schlick and Russell, says hold on. That gray, squishy image is just our perceptual representation of the brain, not the brain itself. Just like the word water doesn't look like H2O, the fact that experience feels different from a gray lump doesn't mean it's not a brain event. Some Russellians tried to solve this by saying introspection reveals the brain's intrinsic properties, which are the qualia. But that feels contingent. Why these qualia? Could they be different? Doesn't that slip back towards dualism? Hayek structuralism avoids this, since even introspection only gives us representations, relations, not intrinsic properties. There's no gap to bridge, no contingent identification needed. The structure is all. What about subjectivity? Does Hayek's approach capture the fact that qualia are experienced from a first-person perspective? Well, for Hayek, the first-person perspective and its associated qualia are the very starting point of all knowledge. He doesn't deny their subjective character. The argument is that defining qualia in terms of their relations within the introspective world itself doesn't seem to leave anything out, unlike defining them in terms of relations to an external, objective brain. It's harder to see what's missing when you're describing the internal landscape, using the internal landscape's own relational structure. So, Hayek's position seems less vulnerable to the charge that it fails to account for the subjective feel of experience. But wait, we've been talking about qualia, but haven't we been dancing around the other big problem? Intentionality? Representation, classification, subjectivity all seem deeply tied to meaning, to aboutness. Hayek's solution for qualia feels incomplete unless we understand intentionality. In fact, his account suggests that having qualia presupposes having intentionality. How? He links acquiring concepts, which is fundamentally an intentional act, to forming those neural connections correlated with external properties. The superimposition of neural impulses that creates the experience of an orange is essentially the superimposition of the concepts associated with it, orangness, roundness, etc. This leads Hayek to a startling conclusion. We have concepts before we have full-blown experience. Concepts aren't abstracted from experience, they enable experience. This primacy of the abstract is a Kantian echo, and it makes the question of how intentionality itself arises even more critical. Does Hayek offer an answer for intentionality? Well, yes and no. He argues that we cannot fully understand the mind, period, whether through naturalistic means or any other. But this limitation isn't proof the mind isn't physical, it's inherent in the nature of the mind itself. Why? Because of that regress we touched on. To consciously know something, like an orange, you need underlying unconscious concepts. To consciously contemplate those concepts, you need meta-concepts and so on. It's an infinite regress. Plus, there's a complexity issue. The system classifying things must be more complex than the things being classified. So, any explaining agent can only explain simpler things. Therefore, no agent can fully explain its own kind of complexity. The human brain can never fully explain its own operations. Mind equals bummer. This has interesting consequences. If the quality of an experience depends on its relations to everything else, and we can never make all those tacit relations explicit, maybe it seems like we're always missing something about quality. But Hayek might say, no, you're just not making the rest explicit yet. The real kicker is for intentionality. In his essay Rules, Perception, and Intelligibility, Hayek argues forcefully, the mind always acts on rules it cannot communicate. Not because some rules are inherently unstateable, but because understanding any rule requires appealing to higher-level rules, which remain unconscious. Meaning and intelligibility depend on this vast, mostly hidden context. We operate according to rules, but we rarely articulate the deepest rules governing our thought. This resonates strongly with John Searle's ideas. Searle talks about a network of intentional states. Your belief about elections shapes your desire to run, operating against a background of non-intentional capacities, like assuming there's an external world. This background is unconscious. Trying to make it conscious just reveals a deeper background. Infinite regress is avoided by simply acting on interpretations of rules without consciously choosing them. Hayek's analysis leads to a similar conclusion. Any explanation of intentionality must eventually stop at the brute fact of the creature acting according to rules. This echoes Gilbert Ryle's famous distinction between knowing that, explicit knowledge, and knowing how, tacit skill. Hayek concludes we'll always have a practical dualism, epistemological, not metaphysical, because our minds can't fully comprehend their own structure. We can grasp the principle, but not the exhaustive details. Now a potential worry arises. If our minds just operate based on arbitrary rules determined by our forms of life, doesn't that lead to relativism? Are our beliefs just culturally contingent? Hayek pushes back hard. He says there is a bridge to objective reality, evolution. Our neural wiring, our concepts, our rules, they aren't formed in a vacuum. They result from our interaction with the environment and the long evolutionary history of our species. Organisms that developed advantageous ways of classifying and responding to the world survived and reproduced. So our mental structures are shaped by objective realities. As Hayek puts it, sense experience presupposes accumulated knowledge based on past co-occurrence, and this knowledge, derived from experience, determines the possible forms of our experiences. It's not arbitrary, it's biologically and environmentally constrained. What about cultural rules, laws, customs, social norms? Surely those are more arbitrary. Hayek again says no, invoking cultural evolution. Rules and practices that help a group adapt to its environment tend to survive and proliferate. Those that don't tend to die out. So the mere survival of a cultural practice provides strong evidence for its adaptive value, reflecting objective facts about the human condition. There's a presumption of objectivity and utility, even if we don't always grasp it. This, Hayek argues, constrains our ability to radically reshape our basic assumptions. The mind is less a guide shaping culture than a product of cultural evolution. Culture and evolution created our reason, not the other way around. These cultural constraints, like biological ones, are rooted in objective reality. Hayek's evolutionary take on intentionality sounds remarkably similar to ideas developed much later by philosophers like Ruth Millikan and Daniel Dennett. They argue that meaning ultimately comes from biological function, what a mental state does for the organism or species. Dennett's concept of memes, cultural ideas evolving like genes, is a perfect parallel to Hayek's cultural evolution. Dennett, in particular, emphasizes that evolved meaning is likely ambiguous and inscrutable, given the messy trial-and-error nature of evolution. Both Hayek and Dennett seem to accept that we are products of long, complex evolutionary processes, biological and cultural, and therefore we shouldn't expect a neat, fully explanatory theory of ourselves. Some mystery will remain. This residual mystery, they suggest, doesn't imply the mind is non-physical. It just reflects the inherent complexity and ambiguity of evolution. But was Hayek right? Did he successfully naturalize the mind? Enter Karl Popper, Hayek's friend and fiercest critic. Popper read The Sensory Order and declared essentially, game over, causal theories of the mind are impossible. His target was Hayek's attempt to explain meaning and intentionality purely through causal chains, like neural wiring or evolutionary history. Popper had two main reasons for this devastating judgment. First, Popper argued that any causal theory of meaning is inherently circular. How do you explain meaning using causality? You say a brain state means cat because it's caused by cats. But how do you pick the right causal chain? Why stop at the cat? Why not the light reflecting off the cat's fur or the retinal stimulation? You decide where the chain begins and ends based on interpretation, based on what you think the meaning is. But that act of interpreting, of picking out significance, is itself an intentional act. So, you're trying to explain intentionality using a theory that already assumes intentionality. It's like trying to explain language using grammar, but defining grammar using language. Hayek himself had criticized behaviorists for doing something similar, ignoring the subjective element in stimuli. Popper accused Hayek of falling into the same trap with his causal chains. Popper's second, equally powerful criticism was about rationality. He argued that causal theories inevitably undermine the very notion of rational belief. How? Because to fit mental processes into a purely causal framework, you have to ignore their meaning and logic. A thought arises because of electrochemical properties, not because it logically follows from previous thoughts. If that's true, then none of our beliefs are ever rationally justified. We just think we are. But if rational justification is an illusion, then no argument, including the arguments for causal theories themselves, can be trusted. It's self-undermining. Hayek had previously criticized social theories that claimed all beliefs were determined by external factors, arguing they were self-undermining because they couldn't be rationally believed. Popper applied this exact same logic to Hayek's own causal theory of the mind. So Hayek drafted a response to Popper, but it never got finished. We don't know how he'd have tackled these devastating points. The truth is, explaining intentionality naturally has tripped up everyone from Brentano to Fodor to Popper himself. Hayek's attempt in the sensory order, while ultimately facing these hurdles, remains valuable. It was a bold, systematic effort to ground the mind in intentionality embedded in human practice, anticipating trends in philosophy and cognitive science. On the question of qualia, it offers a compelling alternative to current fashionable views. Perhaps it teaches us that reductionism has its limits, that we hit a ground floor when we get down to intentional action. If he failed, maybe we shouldn't be too harsh. And if his struggle makes us cautious about scientism, then we've learned a lesson that's very much in Hayek's spirit. That's our look at Hayek's fascinating, if ultimately troubled, journey into the philosophy of mind.